A very warm welcome, everybody who is here live or watching the recording, to the next knowledge share session that we have as part of our performance management transformation project, which I will talk about a little bit in a second. It's my greatest pleasure to welcome an old friend and a highly renowned and highly forward-thinking HR professional this morning, talking about reflections on performance management, lessons from the HR trenches. A very good morning to you, Mark.
A very good morning to you, Otti, and thank you for inviting me along this morning.
Yeah, Mark McAleer, not only a friend of many years, and we both were at British Telecom at some time decades ago. Mark is a truly a beacon of not only progressive thought when it comes to leadership development and business transformation, but I would say progressive action, which probably you will hear a lot more about in a second. Mark has made many friends and a few important enemies over the years, because he has been advancing and challenging the traditional way that we are running and changing businesses. And I can attest to that personally, having been part of Mark's talent pool over the years. Mark has a very distinguished and exciting career. I think what I love with Mark is the fact that there is not a sector I can think of that Mark hasn't worked in. Right, so Mark has worked, as I mentioned, in BT, but in Nomura, in Hess, in Vodafone, in Tesco, Coca-Cola, Nestle, Deutsche Bank, Aviva. I could continue. I think in his CV it says more than 8 sectors, and I don't know what those sectors beyond the 8 would be. So I think Mark has probably worked everywhere, and he's worked in various capacities. So all the traditional HR director roles have been part of Mark's career, but also consulting roles. So he has been on both sides of the fence, which I guess makes his insights even more interesting for us, because I think sometimes you have a different perspectives, being in the action and then being on the action, so looking at the action from a different, the famous Archimedean kind of vantage point to figure out how you can change. And I think that makes it especially interesting. So with that, I will just briefly introduce the proceedings this morning, if I manage to move the slides. So we will start with Mark and his presentation, which will last between 30 and 45 minutes. We will then, depending on the size of the group, go either into a breakout conversation or indeed just a plenary Q&A to see what resonates. And I would suggest this morning, if you want to listen through the presentation for comparison with your own experiences, which are the really bad practices, what Antoinette always calls the kind of the suffering machine practices, right? What should we really stop now? Yesterday, someone suggested to kind of get HR out of the gutter. So what are the things that really we know don't work and they need to stop? On the other hand, what are the things that you really believe are the most interesting, most intriguing new practices? And you might glean some of those from Mark's thoughts here. And finally, I think to a degree, most importantly, how do we drive change? Why the hell are we not driving change? So what are the obstacles or opportunities for getting us onto the right road? So listen in your mind to Mark's presentation with A, what should we stop? B, what should we start? And 3, how the heck are we jointly gonna make it happen? And thereafter, depending on whether we want to continue the usual monthly call, we might go into 3 subjects that have to do with the wider project. And what is this wider project? I have to say it's completely pro bono. So Antoinette and I, together with a bunch of people, some of the faces you can see on the slide here, started this project in Amsterdam last year at the HR Congress Horizon Summit, simply based on the insight that in our mind, not sufficient change, or change is not sufficiently happening in HR yet. Very often HR professionals seem to believe that transformation in HR boils down to installing a new system. And we beg to differ. And we decided at the conference in November last year, that the most important process within the domain of HR is performance management. Because if you think about it, it touches every single aspect of HR, which ultimately is geared towards improving the overarching performance of the business. That's where HR mostly plays, beyond the legal aspect and so on. So our intention is to produce a proposal, a radical performance management manifesto to be presented and co-signed, co-proposed at the HR Congress in Porto in May this year. And with that, my final point is, on behalf of Mihai and Shalva and the whole HR Congress team who are organizing the worldwide HR Summit, and again telling me that they're not making any money out of this this great endeavor. Anyone who wants to join is, of course, wholeheartedly invited. There's even a discount code available for any of you who might get interested, and all the informations are on the HR Congress website. Again, Antoinette and I have no formal involvement, and we are not taking any payments from anyone, so we're not involved in this. We are all on the same page in just trying to advance and support our HR colleagues and friends in making business flourish. And with that, I will take away my slides. And Mark, if you want to take over from your slides. And again, a warm welcome, Mark, this morning, and thank you for taking the time to illustrate some of your thoughts for us.
Next. I think the important thing to say for this presentation, just to be clear, is these are very much personal reflections, personal learnings over my career, and not necessarily the views of BDO. I have to sort of say that as a sort of safe harbor statement at the start of this presentation. But as Otti has very kindly, with his introduction, said, my career has always sort of been in two halves. I actually started life, would you believe, something called a personnel officer, which reminds me of that wonderful slide Otti and Antoinette showed about the different phases of the way HR has grown and developed over the years. And I genuinely believed, as a fresh-faced graduate starting my career in the oil industry with the Hess Corporation, that HR really was here for good. It was there to represent the employees as well as the organization. So I started as an HR officer. I did the whole CIPD thing, which in the UK is essentially the professional body for personnel and development. I also picked up a master's degree along the way, but I'm not claiming to make this an academic presentation. There are people who are far, far more erudite and qualified on this call than I. I spent probably about 20 years in corporate HR, and that culminated where I worked at BT Global Services. I met Otti, and I was global head of talent and leadership and graduate development. And then I spent probably about 15 years as an independent change and OD consultant, as Otti has kindly said, working across a variety of industries from telco, financial services, manufacturing, FMCG, and a little spell, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted it, a little spell with Transport for London, which was my one and only foray into the sort of public sector. Next slide, please, Otti. So, when asked to think about performance management, I sort of sat there in a darkened room with a wet towel over my head and thought, gosh, how can I actually contribute to this debate? And I thought, well, I come at it from the practitioner, trenchman, henchman, take your pick, somebody who's worked in human resources, and also somebody who's advised human resources. So I sort of sat back and thought, what are all the components that typically would make up performance management? Now, your definition may change. There may be things on here I've missed. Depending on the size, complexity, maturity of the organization, you might have some of these, all of these, or different elements. And it struck me that some of them are sort of retrospective. So a lot of performance management can often feel like the school report card, how are we doing? Or how have you done? and there's almost that sense of dread when you get the report card. There are some things in the middle which I'll talk about, which I think are sort of enablers. And the more I noodle on this, the more I sometimes wonder if the machine is now driving the process, and we've taken the sort of the fundamental interaction out of it. And then organizations love to plan. So there's a lot of stuff that sort of has a prospective future lens tied to strategy. So what I'll do is I'll dip into each of these. Some of them I will just sort of, in the interest of time, gloss over. But I just thought it'd be quite good to sort of share my experiences on this landscape. Next slide, please, Otti. So let's start with the biggie. And I say the biggie because over the years, when I talk to disgruntled managers, disgruntled employees, disgruntled C-suite leaders, it often comes back to the rating scale. I think I've seen more or less every rating scale going from when I probably started earlier in my career. The trend was probably more towards 5, good old Likert scale. Scales have come down, 4, 3, 2, 1, take your pick, but I've seen different ones. I think the most creative I saw was actually in Nestle, where they did away with letters and numbers altogether. And they just attached words. It was quite surreal. So they had things like steers and navigates, which I don't know. I thought it was quite surreal. There's also been a trend to splitting the what and the how. So if the rating wasn't complex enough, I think organizations have been trying to make a distinction between the task, the objective, and whether you actually demonstrated the right values and behaviors. This is particularly prevalent in financial services, where the regulators are getting much cuter and they're looking for a company that has a culture that should promote integrity and openness. And there's a bit of a banter going on between financial services and, say, the FCA in the UK, because they keep saying, well, what are you measuring us against precisely? And the regulators will say, well, we'll know it when we see it. Which is quite an interesting debate. I've thought long about categories, and they typically fall into the sort of below expectations, meets expectations, exceeds expectations. But it always makes me wonder, why are we actually upsetting the vast majority of our workforce when actually they meet expectations? But we seem to go through this annual tortuous process in order to tell a minority of people they're below expectations, or a minority, we give them the good news and say they exceed expectations. So I do wonder, what is the purpose of the rating? Now, several of you will be sat there saying, aha, but how do you allocate rewards and bonuses and stuff? So we'll return to that point in a minute. Next slide, please, Otti. Forced distribution. I've met a few fans of it over the years, but they tend to be from the engineering fraternity. I've even worked in some organizations where statistically minded engineers or scientists invent their own scales, even if one doesn't exist. So there is a love of bell curves and distribution. My own observation over the years is I have not seen anything that is so quick to erode trust and to be gamed. And also we never actually figure out the return on investment, because if you think you're getting very expensive managers who could be doing better things with their time to sit having these leveling conversations, it does make you wonder what the return on investment is. And I've seen all sorts of creative ways of gaming this. So, for instance, give new hires a lower rating, but tell them it's just their turn this year, all will be well next year. If you've got graduate hires in your team, you use them as part of your bell curve distribution. So you've probably got the impression I'm not a fan of forced distribution. I personally think it's a waste of time. Next slide, please, Otti. And you're free, of course, to disagree with me when we get to the end of the thing. The annual appraisal conversation, I think this is what I would call the moment of truth, because this is really the the moment a manager sits down with a member of his or her team and has that sort of honest conversation about performance. My own learning over the years is I think the quality of that conversation, and forgive me if this is a statement of the alarmingly obvious, I think the quality of that conversation is directly attributable to the skill of the manager conducting the performance appraisal and the prevailing culture of the organization. And I think, and I've seen the fact that e-learning, blended learning, whilst that has delivered many benefits for organizations, I think we've lost the art of good, solid leadership development. And I'll give you a very quick example. I've worked in organizations where we actually used actors. So you could actually role play different scenarios, and you give managers a kind of a safe environment in which to hone their skills. I did hear from one organization that has started to do that again. And I think organizations have realized that perhaps the investment in basic 101 leadership skills needs to be brought back to the agenda. I mentioned as an aside, I think some of the people who struggle the most, paradoxically, with these type of performance conversations are probably at the C-suite and the senior end of the organizational spectrum. I've had many conversations with C-suite leaders, senior leaders, who kind of lean on HR and say, well, can't you tell him? You're in HR. Can you not deliver the message? Which is rather disappointing when you think that the leaders should be setting the tone from the top. Next slide, please, Otti. Bonus pay benefits. Gosh, where do we start? I think this is probably a topic for a whole nother day. And I know one of the things that Otti and Antoinette have flagged before is that certainly there seems to be this widening gap in big global corporations in particular between the pay and benefits at the top of the house versus the frontline workers, which creates all sorts of moral dilemmas and questions. For me, I think the organizations that put more emphasis, I'm choosing my words carefully, but more emphasis on company performance, divisional performance, what the Americans like to call a clear line of sight. I tend to like that because it's sort of, if you're promoting a culture where we're all in it together, it's a collective culture, we collaborate, we trust one another, and there's a sort of team ethos, that works pretty well. Having said that, I do think there are some areas where you can actually tie performance targets very closely to metrics. Otti and I were moodling on this before the call. So if you're at an operational end of the spectrum and you're talking about a call center or delivery drivers or production, you can incentivize because there's a clear, I hate to use the expression again, but there's a clear line of sight between my personal performance, output, and what I get paid. And people quite like that, particularly salespeople. I do think it's problematic when you get into what I would call knowledge workers. So how do you attribute the contribution of a knowledge worker to an output that might be further down the process? And this is where it becomes quite tricky because you're not actually seeing a hard metric necessarily, but you're seeing a critical bunch of skills come together to deliver for the organization. And you could use the same argument in an agile organization where actually, again, paradoxically, you're being encouraged to fail fast and learn. So it's a fraught, difficult area. Next slide, please, Otti. I've seen different approaches to, if you like, self-evaluation. I think self-evaluation can work quite well. The trouble is it does take you into all sorts of problems with bias, particularly with a sort of from an EDI standpoint. And Antoinette will probably correct me, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence that as a broad generalization, women are probably harsher on themselves, or should we say more honest about performance shortcomings, whereas men tend to sort of big themselves up and say they're fabulous at everything. So I think it can be fraught with difficulty, but if done in the right way, it can be quite useful. There are some good, and I have to dial up the good, there are some good things in some of the HR software. I've seen Workday where you can actually tailor the feedback questions you ask peers and colleagues. And I think that's actually quite neat because it puts the feedback in the control of the individual to a degree. I quite like that. Now, 360-degree feedback. I have a very strong view that I think 360-degree feedback is immensely valuable in a developmental setting, particularly for leaders who are looking to develop their leadership skills, how they're perceived across boundaries, etc. I did have one very senior leader once locked me in a room and he was very upset because he said that his direct report could actually see his rating because he thought it was anonymized. And I had to point out to him that, yes, peers were anonymized, subordinates were anonymized, but he was the only leader. That was quite an interesting conversation. I have seen 360 used for determining bonus payments. Otti may recall it was used at BT. They decided one year the best way to allocate bonuses would be to use 360 feedback. And it became euphemistically known as friends and family, because managers pretty quickly cotton onto the idea of, if I give you good feedback, you give me good feedback, we both win. There's also an alternative name I've heard. Sometimes I've heard it described as a drive-by shooting. But anyway, next slide, please. PIPs, performance improvement plans. Obviously, these have a different legal setting in each country, but typically an organization might say, well, if somebody is a poor performer, we put them on a performance improvements plan. I read a lovely article the other week about McKinsey, and they actually call it concerns, which is a lovely euphemism, concerns. But I have a very, very strong view here that tough performance conversations should not be something that appears at the annual performance review. But all too often, it becomes delayed until the annual performance review, which, if you think about it, could be a 12-month cycle. So, you know, thinking about it, as a manager, am I going to let somebody struggle for 10, 11 months before breaking the news to them that they're not actually meeting expectations? So I wonder if poor performance management is something that actually should be removed from performance management. Maybe a contrarian view, but I wonder if we should be sending the message that good management is about early intervention, is about support and help. It's not about storing up your poor performers to meet a false distribution curve. The other thing I've seen, and this is unfortunately the reality of modern organizational life, employees have realized that they can counter poor performance conversations by raising a grievance or even using the whistleblower line. So it means that increasingly line managers, people managers are leaning more and more on HR. And it's a very, very tricky area. And we live in a sort of era of litigation. And I think it's extremely tricky. But I do believe that early conversations are probably the key to this and not storing things up. Thank you, Otti. I won't dwell on this too much. SMART has been probably done to death, or OKRs. I think there's some merit in this. I think the art of setting clear objectives is easier said than done. And I think, again, this is where managers can benefit from training on how to set decent objectives that are actually tied to some kind of KPI or some kind of outcome. And again, whether OKRs is more your thing, again, I think it's about the training. And I think I've touched on it already. I think the trouble is, particularly in organizations that are working more on a sort of an assignment basis, project basis, agile basis, keeping these objectives and KPIs up to date is a challenge, albeit that the kind of prevailing modern HR systems and tooling and software does take some of the heavy lifting out of it. Next slide, please, Otti. Gosh, the assessment of potential, which is quite often, when people talk about performance management, they quite often lump in performance and talent assessment at the same time. When I started in my career, and this used to confuse me because I worked for an American company, I think there were often two meanings of the word talent. The US parlance tended to mean talent as in the workforce. Everybody has a degree of talent, it's just about maximizing it. Whereas UK companies like Shell or BP or the big corporates tended to think of talent as the sort of the elite slice, if you like, of the workforce that would have an accelerated career to the top of the organization. The ubiquitous 9-box model is now baked into nearly every HR system I've seen, where you have on one axis performance, on the other axis talent. I've seen some organizations, Deutsche Bank had a 4-point performance management scale, so therefore they created a 12-box because that's the way they wanted to do it. I've seen different levels of sophistication in terms of understanding and assessing what talent is, whether that be drive, judgment, impact, learning agility, intelligence, take it what you will. I tend to take a kind of nuanced view on talent identification. I think it can be a useful exercise, but there's a big but. I think the but is what you do with the talent. When I was at BT and I was, for my sins, head of global talent at BT Global Services, when we first started, we sort of spent a disproportionate amount of time and effort on what we used to call weighing the baby. So the annual ritual of identifying talent, badging talent, assessing talent, and then we would literally complete the spreadsheet and say, job done. I think talent is way, way more dynamic than that. And I think organizations that think far more systemically about the moves that people need to have the stretching experiences, I think that's actually leading edge. If you can really think about your leaders, what do they need, what experiences do they need to get to move, I think is the key. And there was a wonderful book, I think, by Morgan McCall on high flyers that always was a great influence on me, because it's like, if you're a manager who's only ever known rapid growth and increased year-on-year sales, funnily enough, you're going to look quite good. But would that same manager be able to deal with a set of challenges in a turnaround division? Always a good point, I thought. Next slide, please, Otti. Then there's always succession planning, and I once worked with a guy at Logica who'd been at the BBC, and he came out, I thought, with a stunning insight that's always stuck with me. He said, you've got to remember, Mark, when people are planning succession for the board, the top team roles, that's about governance. That's about external regulators. That's about, we've got the right people at the top of the house to run the business. But as another great mentor of mine said, and he actually asked this of a board, which I thought was quite funny, when was the last time you sold something? When was the last time you met a customer? And there were some quite blank faces around the table. So I think sometimes organizations get quite obsessed by talent coverage at the top of the house. I remember when BP, and I've forgotten the name of the CEO, had to stand down after the crisis in Dallas or Texas. At the time, BP had 9 ready now successors, and they went external. So for me, I think the key to succession planning is to take a view that it's not just senior roles that exist today. It's also about tying it to your workforce planning and saying, what are the types of skills and capabilities we need in the future, because the role may not exist today. And this idea of perhaps boards could actually stress test and war game their succession plan maybe once a year, because it's very easy to fill in names on a spreadsheet. I've seen it done, where you can have ready now, ready in 3 years, ready in 5 years, and then push comes to shove, and the answer is none of the above. So a bit of honesty in succession planning. The one thing I would say is HR software has actually pushed that process right the way down through the enterprise. So software can now actually help organizations think about coverage for positions right the way through the organization. I think that's a positive innovation. Next slide, please, Otti. I think I've covered a lot of these points, but again, one-to-one feedback. Some organizations try and mandate that. HR becomes the policeman again, making managers give feedback once a quarter, which I've always thought is a very perverse thought. You only give one-to-one feedback each quarter, and it has to be logged and monitored by HR. I think we need to trust managers a bit more, but I think we also need to give them the skills and the confidence to be able to have those conversations. The same with coaching and mentoring. Coaching often has a bad name in corporates. Many a time I've been approached by a senior leader and they start the conversation with, so-and-so, they need some coaching. But what they really mean is they need some remedial coaching and feedback. And I think that's a shame. I do also have a view with coaching, particularly executive coaching. They can be a bit like limpets. Once they're in an organization, they stay for years. I've seen in some corporations coaches who've been hanging around for 3-4 years, and really it's like a paid friend. It's not actually adding any value. So I'm always very wary about external coaches in particular. There needs to be very, very, very clear contracts with outcomes and purpose and all that good stuff. Next slide, please, Otti. Personal development planning, fantastic idea. I've very rarely seen it done well. And I think that's such a shame. I think back to the Charles Handy idea of the inside out donut, that in an ideal world, you should be helping individuals plan their ongoing personal development so that they are up to standard in the job, they can keep being excellent performers in the current job, and maybe they can start to develop new skills, new knowledge to ready them for new jobs. I always think that's a great idea. I think where it falls down, and we'll come to some of the enablers, I think where it falls down is that apart from organizations such as professional services, consulting firms, few organizations have coherent skills, competency frameworks that are actually tied to learning pathways, that are actually tied to experience. And I think that's the critical linkage. I think yesterday one of the speakers was talking about horizontal linkages. I think personally this is the one that is the most broken. I think personal development planning just becomes sort of people sat in an individual life raft bobbing around the sea trying to figure out where they go next. And if I hear 70-20-10 again, I think I'm going to scream. This is the mantra of the modern learning and development function, and I'm having a dig at myself as well here. Well, mate, it's all about 70-20-10. And those who know this, the 10 being the formal learning, the 20 being the coaching, the mentoring, the feedback, the 70 being the experience. And the bit that organizations are particularly poor at is the 70. So you could sort of say that most learning and development functions are only 30% effective, but maybe that's a bit harsh. Next slide, please, Otti. Career planning. Done well, I think this can add some value. And I think historically, if we look at performance management, we look at talent, we look at succession, and this goes back to Taylorism, it goes back to the pin factory we were talking about before this call, Wealth of Nations. A lot of career planning has traditionally been predicated on the leadership track. I remember working years ago at BT, and I was quite new, and they kept talking about he or she needs to manage one of the big battalions. So there were lots of sort of military analogies. Is you start with a team, then you manage a bigger team, and then your route to the top is managing a big battalion and a P&L. So a lot of career planning was slanted towards leadership track hierarchy. And if you've read the leadership pipeline, I had a look at it the other day. It was very good in its time. It was all the sort of practices that GE had. But I think they had about 10, 11 layers in their organization. The reality is now organizations are much flatter. Organizations have outsourced a lot of stuff. So if you think of graduates coming into a business, they can make progress and be seen to be making progress maybe after the first 5 to 10 years. Then it becomes very difficult because organizations by their nature are flatter. So how do you broaden and deepen expertise? Also, how do you create career tracks that appeal to both the technology, the commercial specialist, a lawyer, a financier, as well as somebody who wants to lead the organization? I think it's a really, really tricky area. And when I started work, I was just about lucky enough to start in that era of cradle to the grave, but it soon got smashed. So I think people do take, and not surprisingly, people take far more ownership for their career. So that psychological contract that perhaps years ago would hold people to an organization is gone. Next slide, Otti. Very quickly, enablers. I've touched on a lot of these things, so I'm not going to drain this slide, but I think we need to be very mindful of how HR software is efficient and takes a lot of the paperwork out of things, but we need to be, I think, mindful we don't become slave to the software. It always intrigues me that organizations place great store on the fact that their cultures are unique, their values are unique, their histories are unique, and then they go out and buy one of 4 software platforms and just install it. Doesn't seem congruent to me. I think over the years, training functions, OD functions have become diminished. They've been outsourced. So where I think a lot of organizations have lost the art and science of having internal specialists who can actually design the right learning interventions, like the right programs that can actually develop the organization. And I think I've already touched on skills and knowledge frameworks. This can become a cottage industry. I've seen, I think it was in BP, where even one function had 4 different frameworks floating around. I think it can be worth the effort. One other just quick comment on skills frameworks. Organizations should try and keep them away from compensation and benefits frameworks, because you end up in a position where skills inadvertently become tied to hierarchy. And I think that's not the way flatter knowledge-based organizations work. Why could you not have an expert reporting to a more senior person who isn't an expert? That kind of synergy argument. Next slide, please. I think the biggest challenge with performance management I've seen over the years is the prevailing culture is what shapes performance management, and you kind of end up in this sort of bind where the people who are most successful in the organization have been shaped by the existing culture, and they're the people who end up in senior leadership positions. So if you like, they are a manifestation of that culture, and it takes, I think, a lot of courage, patience, and conviction to shift a culture. We've often seen it's usually predicated by a crisis. So I remember years ago talking to somebody at Shell, and he was trying to ramp up leadership development, and frankly was meeting a lot of resistance. Then they had a big scandal with recoverable oil. If you've got long memories, they basically doctored their recoverable figures, and suddenly the board room doors opened, and they said to him, please, we need all the help we can with leadership development. So sometimes it does take a crisis or a pivot point, maybe a new CEO, maybe a merger. There's often something that triggers the need to look again at the culture. And I think HR can play a part in that, but I think it really takes a courageous coalition at the top to try and do that. And I'm just also going back to one other point, which I think Otti had mentioned on a previous call we had, is unfortunately some large corporations can be sort of breeding grounds for sociopaths and psychopaths. I think Manfred Kitt-Friis wrote a lovely book, which I enjoyed many years ago. I think it was something like Life in the Executive Fast Lane. And I think this is a real challenge for big corporations, because once a style like that gets embedded in an organization, I think you get the gap between the espoused lovely posters on a wall that say openness, trust. Google, as if you want to do it for a bit of fun, Google Enron's values. It always tickles me when you Google the values that Enron were promoting and how did that work out. So it's a big complex subject, probably a whole nother talk, but I think we can't ignore the norms and behaviors that shape performance management. Last slide. Hopefully I haven't depressed everybody. There wasn't the intent to depress everybody on this call. I think we need to go back to some of the fundamentals of what does excellent people management look like? What is it in your organization that great people managers do? And how do we actually then develop the rest to at least come close to that? You know, what does good look like? And I think it's not an e-learning. I hate to break it to everybody, it's not on a disc. It has to be back to good old equipping our managers with the right skills. If we have to have a rating, why don't we just keep it really clean and really simple? We give people a really positive message around, hey, you're meeting the expectations. Let's now talk about you, your development, what you'd like to do. Because it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is a high performer, they want to actually build a career. I have actually come across individuals who are exceptional performers, but they're not actually interested in taking on more responsibility. That's okay. Again, I mentioned earlier, let's take poor performance away from performance management, which sounds counterintuitive, but let's enable managers to have those conversations outside this formal cycle. Reward and recognition, a big topic, and I'm no expert on this, but I think the more we can decouple reward decisions from performance management and talent, the better. Except the fact that some people are motivated purely by money and tailor their plans accordingly, like sales professionals. I think the increasing challenge as we get into a more complex technological AI type of world is people need to be broadening and deepening their skills. I mean, I met one organization the other week and I thought it was brilliant. In order to get over the fear of accountants introducing AI, machine learning, they literally started to say, but what added value work would you like to be doing if this went away? So it actually overcame the resistance because it became more of a conversation around, if you're doing 15 things in your job today and you could get rid of the bottom 3 admin things, what value could you deliver for the business or the customers? And they found there was no resistance to that because there's lots of boring stuff in finance. I think we need to, as I mentioned before, we need to rethink the 9 box. I mean, there's probably lots of views on the 9 box on this call, but I think it's what you do with talent that's important, not filling in a box. I think it was Drucker who said that an organization gets the HR function it deserves. I think, you know, to sort of play on that, I think an organization gets the performance management approach its culture deserves. So maybe top teams need to take a bit more ownership and not play this sort of game of acquiescence where on the one hand they're blaming HR for a poor process and a poor outcome, but they're not taking accountability for it.
Wonderful. First and foremost, a big virtual applause, I would suggest, Mark. That was an impressive tour de force across all the elements of performance management. And boy, I mean, it was funny that you started every single section with "gosh" and kind of surprising yourself about some of the problems that were on those slides. But a lot of it resonated, and I think, yeah, a lot of reflections, as you suggested, are due. And it's kind of funny because we didn't start the reflections yesterday, and we're still in reflection mode rather than in doing mode. And so, Mark, I want to ask you a few questions because I thought it was a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much for that. I wondered a little bit, what was missing for me is what's the role of HR in this? Because I think you mentioned a few times HR can do things, but kind of it depends on leadership, and I think you said coalition at the top and so on. Is that not a little bit of an excuse? Is it not also true that the organizations get the kind of HR teams they deserve? And is it not for HR to be part of this revolution, at least, if not the instigators or catalysts of this revolution? So in a nutshell, what's the role of HR?
It's a very good question. Having worked in HR, I think one of the, and again, it depends where your HR director or your chief people officer sits, because one of the constant dialogues I hear from HR is, but we need a seat at the top table. This the sort of mythical seat at the top table. And I think what HR, and you and I have had this debate before, I think what HR has tried to do with a lot of positive intent is tried to demonstrate its kind of business acumen. So it outsourced a lot of stuff. And don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of outsourcing stuff that isn't core. So payroll, for instance, fantastic. We've got a better payroll. But it's in that desire to be commercial, perhaps HR has either cut too much, like, well, let's get rid of the learning function because that's costing us a fortune. We can outsource that. Well, you can to an extent, but where are your internal SMEs? The other one I think HR people are chasing at the moment is HR analytics. If only we had more analytics, the business would listen to us. And again, I take a nuanced view. HR analytics and analysis is a good thing, provided you can answer the so what. Telling me 62 reasons why I've got attrition is interesting, but what are you going to do about it? I think what HR needs to get better at is not designing processes without outcomes in the belief that the business will like them. So I'll give you a very good example. Vodafone a few years ago did a great thing. This is the HR function. They did a great thing. They went to the top team and said, we've got the bandwidth to re-engineer the performance management process this year, or to focus more on customer service. And the business said, they made a grown-up decision. They said, performance management process is good enough. We really need HRs to step up to the plate on customer service. So that's the choice they made. And I think the more progressive HR functions are more prepared to have those honest conversations with the top team. I don't know if that answers your question.
A little bit of focus I hear, not getting distracted, especially from analytics, which is another question I have. We didn't focus much on technology. So I think I'll ask another question. So I'll ask three more questions, and then we're going to have questions from the audience. I see Antoinette is warming up. What are you going to do? It's kind of easy to critique everybody, right? And I think we need to look into the mirror and say, where do we go from here? Like you titled your last slide. And I saw a few suggestions. So my question now, in the consulting role that you are, if there was one thing that you yourself would put onto your flag, so to speak, in regards to the interactions you're going to have with future companies, what would you pick as a battleground that is reasonable, feasible, and will have impact?
I think, and this isn't a sales pitch, but I think one of the things that we can help organizations with is actually knitting together all these pieces. I think HR as an offering has become a bit of a smorgasbord. So some organizations do this brilliantly well, but few have connected the workforce planning, the organizational design, the skills and competency frameworks, career development, learning strategies. These are all things that are easy to say, but how you actually knit those together, I think that's where I think we can help.
Fair point. As a consulting company, if you took the stance of an HR director inside the company, would your answer differ?
I think it would. I think one of the big opportunities, it wouldn't. I think one of the big opportunities for HR directors is to, if you think of the financial planning and analysis that big organizations do, I think one of the most insightful things, I have to give credit to a guy called Rupert Morrison, who's done a lot of work in this space, is saying, well, if you've got FP&A thinking of the hard side of an organization, HR should be coming with organizational analysis and sort of saying, well, if this is the strategy and this is kind of where we're going to make our investments as a business, then let's have a grown-up conversation where we can really think about the shape of the organization, and we as an HR function can bring more than pretty slides. There's some analysis, there's some depth, there's some clarity to what we can bring.
Interesting. I would have actually chosen a different point, thinking about your it's almost like Margaret Archer's morphogenesis, right? So there's a cycle where culture influences people, people influence the structures re-influence the culture, etc. So there's a what Mats Alvesson talks about as functional stupidity in the system, and my mind would have almost been, which of these elements can I easiest influence? Well, structure. Culture changes, we know that's going to be 5 to 10 years. That's not the thing. So structures, yeah, maybe if I can do big restructuring, otherwise it's probably policy changes, which I can do fast. But it seems to me, based on what you said, the easiest lever is get the assholes out, right? So really make sure that the leaders at the top are the right leaders. Is that not a necessary conclusion?
But I think the way you shift the culture intelligently is if you've got clear line of sight between the strategy, where the business is, the hardwired on the FP&A. I think having a sensible view or game plan on the shape of your workforce, because if you think about it, you go back 10, 15 years, people used to just move boxes around. It was the game of move boxes around on the organization, who's in favor, big team, small team, move them, give them a window seat. I think the more nuanced view now is to sort of say, actually, when we think about organizational design, we're thinking about the workforce at the same time. We're simultaneously thinking about the shape of our workforce, future skills, what is a smart design that does the best thing for the customer, the best thing for our employees, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, here I'm coming from an agile tradition, of course, and I would suggest there's very little that you can plan in the long term. So these ideas that we have some big brains in the middle that align all these pieces and then roll it out, I think I've come to doubt that.
I think it's I think it's more dynamic than that. I think this is where you and I agree, because within that design you can have agile elements, but it's not a sort of Soviet 5-year plan. I think that's gone. But what you need to do is organizations need to have a much better understanding of their workforce than here's a succession plan we roll out once a year, and I think we've got some people who can do AI somewhere. You need to have a much better idea of the shape of your workforce, the demographics, the turnover, what drives them, etc.
Got it. Last question, and then I hand over to Antoinette and people on the call. I see Carl is also frowning already. So last question, technology. So we didn't go much into technology, but one of the things that certainly Antoinette and I had troubles with in talking to lots of HR people is that this belief that the rollout of the next HRIS is going to somehow transform the world, right? So this trust and techno-optimism. So I want to just ask you, Mark, and you've pointed out a few times that technology can help, right? Yesterday, I think we heard from Simon that technology, especially AI, can create lots of havoc if we're not careful. So where do you position yourself, and any final words on making technology useful?
I think it comes, if we take a step back, I think it comes back to design of what you're trying to do. So I think you're right. I think a lot of organizations, and I use my words carefully, a lot of organizations install a system. So, and we talked about this earlier, about this sort of tacit belief that if I'm measuring all the different bits and it's all being aggregated through this system, which again tends to be hierarchical, then somehow if I aggregate everything, I'm doing a fantastic job in terms of managing the performance of the organization. May or may not be true. I think we need to step away from just simply installing. And what I mean by that is I've been involved with some S/4HANA projects in the past. What happens is that you become driven by the technology. And pretty soon you're into which field, you're into segregation of duties, you're into access rights, you're into approvals, which is all important stuff. But you need to actually sort of step back and say, park the technology. What outcomes do we actually want between a manager and his or her team? What outcomes do we want from, how do all the bits actually architect together? So what are we actually trying to do between performance development, career development, reward, and then the technology can play, I think, a supporting role. So to use Richard Beckhardt, who, for those of you with long memories, I loved his stuff on OD. He used to talk about, actors and the stage. So to steal shamelessly from Richard Beckhardt, we need to think about the actors on the stage and what play is unfolding. We don't let the scene shifters dictate what's going on stage. The technology is the scene, is the stage, is the curtains, but the real focus should be on the actors on the stage.
Very interesting. It brings back some fond memories of my statistics classes, where our professor always implied that if you torture data long enough, nature will confess. And I think some of this belief in the omniscience and in the almightiness of technology is not always well founded, as you say. I think the second point on the scene that you mentioned is there's the individualist part, and then there's the aggregation of individuals to represent the whole, and the belief that methodological individualism implies that you can just aggregate individuals and reconstruct organizational performance is very misplaced. So there's a question of how do individuals create the whole. But I think here I will stop it and reopen it. But I want to thank you, Mark, on behalf of everybody, for having taken out the time, developed such a wonderful summary of many decades in HR with lots of interesting things for people. And of course, we will share the slides for everybody so you can look at the finer details. There were many other points that Mark kind of glossed over. So Mark, again, a big thank you on all our behalf. And yeah, as you said, organizations get the performance management they deserve. So here's hopefully some takeaway for people to think about it and make things better. Thank you very much again, Mark, and everybody.